I'm Isis Arabe, Artistic Director of the March on Washington Film Festival, and welcome to our next session of our Scholars Symposium. Our speaker has practiced law for more than 46 years. During his entire career, he has specialized in civil rights actions and complex litigation. He established his firm in 1971 in Tallahassee, Florida. Besides publishing a 2-volume work on employment discrimination, he has also written Voices of Civil Rights Lawyers, Reflections of the Deep South, 1964 to 1980, about which he will speak today. He was recognized by the National Law Journal as one of the best employment discrimination lawyers in America. He has dedicated his life to the movement, and we are so proud to have him today. Please welcome Kent Spriggs.
Thank you. It's actually 53 years now. I date myself. This is the book which the University Press of Florida has somehow not gotten here today, so unfortunately cannot be purchased today here. It's an anthology with 26 different lawyers, with 70 different chapters. It's organized in a thematic way so that the first section has to do with how did young people become civil rights lawyers? And that's divided into people from the North, people from the South, a very different evolutionary process. It has sections of how did the civil rights movement in the South, Black civil rights movement, how did that inform subsequent movements such as the women's movement and LGBT concerns. I thought it was very important that each of the attorneys speak in his or her own voice. There was a time when gathering the stories together was difficult, and two of the people I respect most in the world said, well, why don't you just go interview everybody and then publish it? And I decided not to. There's this timeliness in that this is an age cohort that's dying. I'm 79. During the writing process, 2 of the people who had promised to write died during the process. So clearly, it had to be done now or not. I had written a 2-volume law treatise, but that did not prepare me intellectually or as an author for writing and editing narrative. Happily, my wonderful wife, Kathleen, who is sitting right there, edited all my work and some of the work of some of the other persons who contributed. And clearly, I felt that my ability to write and edit narrative improved because legal writing and narrative are 2 different literary vehicles. I'm going to tell a story. It's got 4 parts. It's called 2 Arrests, 1 Beating, and a Moment of Weakness. I was in 1966 in the summer. I went to Mississippi as a volunteer lawyer, and I was working with the Lawyers Constitutional Defense Committee, and on a Sunday morning, somebody burst in and said, Dr. King has filed a suit in Meridian, and he needs these subpoenas served on Sheriff Rainey and Deputy Price. Now, all of you know your civil rights history, know who these people are. And then everybody in the room knew who they were. So in one of those moments, I just raised my hand, and another young man, who I subsequently found out had been an Army spy in East Germany, he also raised his hand, and the 2 of us went off to Philadelphia, Mississippi, in Neshoba County. We got there. I took the subpoenas into the courthouse where the sheriff normally hangs out, but nobody was there. Deputy Price wasn't there. So we said, well, we might as well go to the Black neighborhood and go to the Freedom House and see who's there, and maybe they'll have some idea how to find the sheriff. So we went to the Freedom House, and we met Reverend Slaughter, who is the leader of the civil rights movement in Neshoba County. He had recently had his nose broken by law enforcement. So here's Reverend Slaughter, the saintly man with a big bandage around his nose. So we're talking to Reverend Slaughter and some other leaders of the civil rights movement, and somebody said, hey, over there. A couple 100 yards away was a patrol car. And they said, oh, it's Cecil Price. So my partner walked down there and tendered the subpoena to Cecil Price. He came back, and we said, well, let's go find the sheriff now. We got in the car, and he said, no, it's way too tense. He's crazy, which, of course, we kind of knew. And that was a moment, because I figured this is here I live in the land of white privilege, lawyer privilege, education privilege, all these privileges. This is the one day that I could make some tiny little contribution to the life of the civil rights movement in Philadelphia, Mississippi. And I told him, no, we're not leaving. We're going to go try to find the sheriff. So we went back to the courthouse, and I went in, and sure enough, there's the sheriff, and Deputy Price is there also. So I went up to Deputy Price, and I tendered the subpoena, and you can imagine what he said. Get that out of my, or I'll put it, yeah, right, you got it. Of course, Deputy Price comes in at about maybe 266.4 when he's wet. And the sheriff was little. He was about 225, 6'2" or so. He's a really large guy. So then I turned to the sheriff and I said, Sheriff, I'm tendering a subpoena. You're supposed to appear in federal court in Meridian tomorrow. And he said, where are you from, boy? And I gave what is absolutely, of course, the worst conceivable answer. I was working for a civil rights law firm in New York City. And I said, New York City. And, of course, that was a really bad answer. And he said, I don't know how you do things where you come from, but down here we do things according to law and order. And I thought to myself, yeah, let's see, the murder of Cheney, Schwerner, Goodman. He said, you're impersonating a federal officer. I said, no, Sheriff, you're getting confused between a summons and a subpoena. This is a subpoena. This forces you to go to court tomorrow. A summons would commence the action. I would have to be a federal marshal for a summons. I don't have to be for a subpoena. And I thought to myself, I really imagine that Sheriff Rainey enjoys having this little white boy from New York talk to him about the law. Anyhow, he said, you're under arrest. I said, oh, okay. So he didn't put me in a jail cell. I don't know why he exercised discretion, but he didn't. He put me in a room, and I was definitely under arrest. I was there about 3 hours, and I could hear him through the door. After a while, what he didn't know is we worked in a fail-safe system. So as soon as I didn't reappear from the courthouse in a half hour, my buddy called the home office in Jackson, and Jackson called, the home office called the FBI, and the FBI most surely called Rainey's lawyer, because 2 weeks before that, the United States Supreme Court had reinstated the federal charges against them. And I could hear him on the phone, probably to his lawyer, saying, but, you came here, and I'm sure his lawyer was saying, Sheriff, you got enough on your plate, just let it go. So after about 3 hours, he did let us go. And from that day forward, I always regarded being willing to put oneself in harm's way for a greater cause as the Neshoba County test. So the next arrest was exciting and very different. In 1968, you will remember that Dr. King had organized a march on Washington. And of course, he was assassinated, but the March on Washington went forward. It commenced in Mississippi and ended up in what was named Resurrection City on the south side of the reflecting pool. It was a tent city that probably housed 300 or 400 people. I was working with migrant workers at that time, and I took my summer vacation, in quotes, and to help the Legal Defense Fund provide legal services for the people at Resurrection City. They were there about, the city existed for about 6 weeks, but at some point, they existed legally under a permit from the Park Service. At some point, the powers that be just said, okay, well, that's enough. So the next Monday morning, they dispatched, one group marched up to Capitol Hill, and the other group came in from the outer edges of the tent city and into the sort of central square, being mindful that they were going to get arrested. The day before, I had talked to Roger Wilkins, who was the Assistant Attorney General of the United States. And I said, Roger, we take the position that people in tent city are entitled to legal representation at the time of their arrest. This is, as a pure legal matter, this is very dubious. But Roger was very partisan to what we were doing. And he said, oh, yeah, Ken, just definitely do that. So there I was in the central square on that morning, and I stared across. You know how long the reflecting pool is. Imagine law enforcement agencies, literally, shoulder to shoulder, all the way around the far side of the reflecting pool and in back of Tent City. It was a sight not soon to be forgotten. So they started a pincher movement, just moving in, and then they hit the outer edges of the tents, and they started tearing down the tent city. And pretty soon, they were in the central square, and they were arresting everybody. And of course, I said to the officer, oh, I have permission to be here by the Assistant Attorney General of the United States. And he said, you're under arrest. And I was taken and loaded on the bus. The best part about this arrest was the company was great. I remember specifically I was in the same cell as Hosea Williams, which I thought was really an honor in itself. They took us to Georgetown because so many people were being busted, they couldn't handle us at the central receiving facility downtown. So we were there, and about 9 o'clock, they put us on a bus and take us downtown for arraignment. They put me in a cell by myself, and I'm not sure why that was. Not just because I'm white, because other white people have been arrested, but well, you know, for whatever reason, they put me in a cell by myself. They took away my glasses. I think they were afraid. They were made of glass. I think they thought I was going to cut my wrists or something. Yeah. So in walks a U.S. attorney, assistant U.S. attorney, and said, boy, you are in big trouble. You know, we're going to take your license away, blah, 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 blah. And I said, I've only got one question for you. When I go before the judge to be arraigned, and I tell the judge that the Assistant Attorney General of the United States of America gave me the permission to be where I was, when I was, what are you going to tell the judge? And he had this really bad look on his face, like, oh, I don't know how to play this one. And he stormed out of the cell and came back in a few minutes and said a bunch of face-saving things like, you're really in trouble, but just this one time, I'm going to give you a break, or, you know, you can imagine. So that was the second arrest. So I was in Mississippi as a summer volunteer in '66. I went back to live in '68 through '70. We were actually funded with OEO money, But basically, I and a couple others ran a civil rights law firm that covered the northern half of Mississippi. So, but all that time in Mississippi, I never got beat up. It wasn't until I moved to Tallahassee and established what has become my permanent residence that I got beat up. So there was a woman who had the temerity to date a black man, white woman, married a black man. Her neighbor was having a hard time handling this, and he was terrorizing her, and even more sort of emotionally wrenching, terrorizing her 3 minor children. So I went to federal court, and I got an injunction from a pretty conservative judge to tell him to stop, harassing the family. So I thought, well, that's pretty good. Well, not shortly thereafter, after hours, I'm all by myself in the law firm, and in walks the guy and his buddy, and they jump me, and they beat me up pretty good. I had abrasions down my back and tore my shirt and all this kind of stuff. So I took, got cleaned up a little, took my shirt, walked down to the police station, it was only 3 or 4 blocks away, and told them what had happened. They wouldn't swear out a warrant. Because in Tallahassee in 1971, I had done something worse than an assault. I had been defending the rights of this woman to be free from racially motivated attacks by her neighbor. So go backward to 1969, and I'm living in Mississippi, and one of our offices was in West Point, Mississippi. It's very tense. There's been a lot of civil rights activity. People are getting short. And so I got done with West Point, and I was driving home to Oxford, and I remembered that one of the leaders of the movement was, well, 2 of the leaders were a husband-wife team who ran a grocery. The grocery up a very long cul-de-sac. So I, just as a courtesy call, drove up. Only the wife was there. We exchanged pleasantries. I told her how things had gone, and that seemed fine. I started down the hill of the cul-de-sac, and about halfway down, there's these 2 pretty rough-looking white boys in a car driving up the road. And I said, all my little antennae were going, knowing she's there by herself. And I didn't turn around. I drove back to Oxford, called her up. Blessedly, nothing bad had happened. Turned out they didn't have any evil intent. But I realized that I had failed the Neshoba County test, which is a teachable moment for me that, sometimes I, and maybe others too, are not all that we set ourselves to be. Let me read to you from a couple other people who contributed to the volume. One is Connie Slaughter. Connie Slaughter, when I was in Oxford, Connie Slaughter was a student, an African-American student, really in the first wave of African-American students at the law school at Ole Miss. And then she was graduated, and she became a lawyer for the Lawyers Constitutional Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. She recites that, I received a call from someone requesting to speak with an attorney. I advised that I was an attorney. And the caller said, no, I want to speak to Larry Cross, or a real attorney. Now, I'm going to digress because I saw the same thing happen in our Oxford Home Office. We had a staff attorney, Alex Sanders, who's a fine attorney, and somebody came in once to me as the deputy director and said, they assigned me to Mr. Alex, but I want a real attorney. And I said, Mr. Alex is a real attorney. So there is this, and these are black clients, of course. So anyhow, so once, Connie says, once I convinced him that I was a real lawyer, he advised that high school students had been arrested for protesting in support of a national Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. holiday, and they were incarcerated with adult criminals, a not uncommon practice in Mississippi at the time. He wanted us to come over and get them out of jail, so we traveled to Rankin County, but we were unable to get the youths out of jail. The next day, George Taylor, her supervisor, and I appeared for the youths before Chancellor Porter in the Rankin County courtroom to inform him that we had removed the jurisdiction from, so the cases were no longer in the youth court. Now they were actually had been transferred to the federal court. So the state court had no more jurisdiction. And I'm sure the state court judge was displeased at this. As I rose from my seat to make the announcement of the removal, the chancellor yelled, "Nigger, if you get out of that seat, Sheriff, I'll have you arrested." Stunned and very angry, I paused and froze in a half-bent position. I was determined not to give him the pleasure of arresting me to join my clients, but I was hell-bent on making certain he was not going to intimidate me. George Taylor said, "Connie, please don't stand up. Just sit down, because if you go to jail, who's going to represent the children?" He added, "Imagine him without a robe or any clothes on." I looked around and saw the children clients. I turned to George and thanked him for trying to be humorous and hugged the children clients as well as their parents. There's, Mac Farmer was a great lawyer who was in Mississippi from 65 to 67. And he writes as part of his chapter on elements of procedure I missed at Harvard Law School. He said, my introduction to Mississippi justice occurred right after I got to Mississippi. The town of Philadelphia, where Goodman and Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner were killed in 1964. They were assassinated by a group of KKK, including Sheriff Rainey and Deputy Sheriff Cecil Price. A core worker in the town had been charged with carrying a concealed weapon, a shotgun that was hanging in the back window of her Volkswagen, which was a standard in almost everybody's car or pickup in Mississippi. I was told to drive to Philadelphia to attend her trial on the charge before the Justice of the Peace. The trial, in quotes, was in a gas station. In Mississippi, to be a Justice of the Peace, one didn't have to even have a high school education. The guy who ran this garage was the Justice of the Peace, so they were having court in the garage. I looked up the Mississippi concealed weapons statute, and it only covered shotguns with a barrel of less than so many inches. I picked up the core worker and took her to the gas station. Deputy Cecil Price was the prosecuting officer. I asked him if he would take a tape and measure that I had brought, the shotgun, measure the barrel. He did, and I asked him how long it was, and he told me that it was a number of inches, which was greater than the maximum length covered by the statute. I said, "Your Honor, on the basis of the fact that the shotgun isn't covered by the statute, I ask that the charges be dismissed." Price took the shotgun, pointed it at my head, and said, "Boy, either she's guilty or you're dead." The Justice of the Peace said, "Guilty as charged." We paid a fine, and I helped her leave Philadelphia, Mississippi, as she was not going to last there much longer. So these are the kinds of stories I try to tell. There are things happen to some of the lawyers, and of course, obviously, regular civil rights workers. They're infinitely worse than anything happened to me. But it was great being there. I'm very glad I had a chance to collect these voices. The volume is very loaded toward Mississippi, partly because of my own experience, partly because of there were actually more civil rights lawyers in Mississippi in the time frame of 64 to 70. So if we have any questions. Everybody is silent. Well, but nobody has any questions.
Hold on, here's a mic.
Here's a mic.
Hi. Hello. Hello. My name's Paul Angel.
Oh.
Hello? And my question is, did you wind up, talk about the relationship between the state judges and the federal judges? Did you wind up before the Fifth Circuit?
Yes. In Mississippi, essentially all the state judges were terrible. Blessedly, for us, really quite amazingly, the two judges in the Northern District of Mississippi, which covered about the northern half of the state, the two federal judges were really pretty good. And we won most of our cases there. On occasion, we had to go to the Fifth Circuit. Mississippi was part of the Fifth Circuit at that time. And we did very well in the Fifth Circuit. The Fifth Circuit was chock with people who really believed in enforcing the 14th Amendment. And so in one sense, it was very easy to be a civil rights lawyer in terms of winning in those times in that place. Yes, ma'am.
We've heard a lot recently about
Please use the mic
the
for the light.
lynchings that occurred in the South throughout this period and before, particularly because of the memorial in Alabama. I'm wondering if you or your organization prosecuted those cases, or you can talk about how that history that was going on at the time is integrated with the legal efforts that were going on in the South, or maybe not so much.
Yeah, I've never been a prosecutor, so I didn't prosecute any of those cases. I've followed the history. I noticed there's been a renewed interest in the Emmett Till murder in Money, Mississippi. Like 15, 20 years ago, some of my friends who were law clerks for me at Ole Miss Law School started 30 years after the fact, starting to prosecute some of, like, I think, Beckwith and some other people who had committed atrocities 30 years before. So there has been some interest. There's obviously, Mississippi as a whole is not exactly a Renaissance place, but I think one of the things I saw with all these law clerks from the University of Mississippi, this was the first generation of indigenous white Mississippians who were willing to openly identify with the Black Civil Rights Movement and do that. So is that responsive? We're not sure.
Well, I guess, does your book cover the attorneys, the prosecutors, the local, federal? I mean, they are attorneys who were obviously on the other side, but played a significant role in the civil rights movement and progress, whether they were actually prosecuting cases they should have been or whether they were ignoring them. So Perhaps it's not covered in your book. I
No,
don't know.
it pretty much is not covered. Everybody in this book is a civil rights lawyer who was, some of them defended criminal cases, but none of them prosecuted criminal cases. I guess, yeah. In the back and in the front, see?
I was wondering if
Oh.
your book or either your own perspective shares considerations of how the language of civil rights, certainly the kinds of moral claims that were being made in the late 60s, have been co-opted by white Mississippians and others with respect to either white nationalism or the fact that their sense of being put upon or oppressed by minorities. Alan Dershowitz said in a speech a couple of weeks ago that quote-unquote conservatives are the ones whose rights are being trampled upon since minorities are now empowered. And so it's more or less a question about how you think about 50 years of the language of civil rights in your lawyering experience.
Have we got an hour or two? This is Dr. Muhammad, who just posed the question on the faculty at Harvard. Let me try several things. Number one, part of what was true then was that the contradiction of segregation and the degree of oppression, whether through almost very few persons of color being allowed to vote, or physical assaults on people of color being unredressed, that created the tipping point that I would argue led to the Civil Rights Act of '64, which of course did employment and public accommodations, and the Civil Rights Act of '65, which was the Voting Rights Act. Both came in, of course, under President Johnson. So we really, as I used to say, in terms of the congressional action, those things were so bad that the great white mushy middle, Nebraska, Kansas, states without a strong history, well, with very small African-American populations, they were willing to join the legislative fight, and we passed those two really incredibly important things. Of course, the Voting Rights Act having been just slashed a couple of years ago in a really tragic and moderately dishonest case. So that was then. I think one of the things that's disturbing to me is that in the years between then and now, and starting a couple decades ago at least, I have concerns about the use of the word diversity. And I would suggest, since I'm talking to an academic, it decontextualizes the experience of African Americans in the United States of America. It's like, it's like we're not going to talk about slavery. We're not going to talk about Jim Crow. We're just going to, some vague numbers that we have this many blacks, this many browns, and this many whites, or something like that. And I think it's just, and the nation, you can see this in the judicial opinions. And the nation has really been lulled into this decontextualization. And I think it's it's that whole thing, you forget the lesson of history, you're doomed to repeat it. Now, I'm not sure where to go with white boys feeling oppressed. I'm having a hard time with that. They've got a president in the United States, so they can't be too oppressed, I guess. I don't know. I think it is fascinating that the alt-right loves Putin. Isn't that interesting? The fascists are loving whatever brand of Putin's authoritarianism exists. I'm not sure what you call it. Well, maybe. I don't know. I'm not sure of the label, but the alt-right, clearly, they self-identify as being fascist. I mean, and they do swastikas and stuff like that. So I don't know. How much of an answer is that?
Was there another question back there? And then we just have a few moments, so quick questions, quick answers.
All right, well, this question sort of follows on the previous. I'm curious on your views of the current appointments to the court around the country by our current president and how you see this, dare I say, potential for eroding any of the efforts that you made 30 years ago. And where are we going? What's happening? How did we get here?
I'm not a CNN or MSNBC talking head. I think you can. Yeah, it's all bad. It's not just bad for African Americans. It's certainly going to be bad for women. It's going to be bad for unions. Well, we've already seen that this term without the new player. So, I mean, no, at the Supreme Court, I will probably in my lifetime never see a Supreme Court that does anything for me. I mean, that I feel is middle of the road.
Well, thank you for telling the fascinating stories of your involvement, of your activities. Could you summarize a couple of the stories of the other people in the book? Or provide some highlights?
I think I'm going to get flagged down by the...
Give us one.
What? Well, let's see. Henry Aronson and Marion Wright Edelman, who was then Marion Wright, but probably known to probably everybody in this room, were both lawyers for the Legal Defense Fund office in Jackson, Mississippi. Henry had a pilot's license. So while we would drive around Mississippi, he was flying around Mississippi. And one day he was flying into, you guessed it, Neshoba County to land his plane. And all of a sudden he realized that he was being shot at. So he pulled up and went to the neighboring county. And I'm not sure how he got there to Philadelphia, but I'm sure he did. So these are crazy times. Henry also had an event during the school desegregation in Grenada, Mississippi, where gunshots were fired, and he ended up kind of hiding underneath a car. So I tell you, my little stories are really paled in significance against some of the other people. I mean, David Lippman is a great civil rights lawyer. He was monitoring an election in Yazoo City. This is later, too. This is like 1971 or 72. And somehow nobody else was around, and a few yahoos came up to David, and they actually put a gun barrel in his mouth. Thank God they decided not to shoot him, but these things were still happening then.
Last question. What advice would you give young attorneys now facing some of the same issues around voting rights or around police brutality or around the prison industrial complex as it relates to civil rights struggles about longevity in the movement? You've survived and kept practicing.
How many hours do you want for this answer?
Just the top highlights
Okay.
of what it takes, two or three things they should be thinking about.
Several things. There's still racial discrimination in employment, okay? So it's hard to set up a practice doing this, but it can be done, and sadly, it's still out there. On voting rights, yes, they did gut a major portion of the voting rights, but there is still something in the statute dealing with intentional discrimination, which is a much harder thing to prove than the way it was being proved before, but it is, there are cases that are proving it. There was one in North Carolina. This is a recent good example. One in Texas. So again, these are private litigation opportunities to advance the cause of stemming the tide of racism.
And how, as an individual, have you kept going all these years?
Joyfully.
Thank you.
I always said, no, I mean, really, I mean, I'm not teasing. I always felt that I grew up, the first political thing I can remember, other than singing songs about Hitler as a jerk when I was 5 years old, was watching the Army McCarthy hearings. And my father was a brilliant scientist and was terrified, as was the entire government service of McCarthy. So it was the age when McCarthy really rolled back the First Amendment and implicitly a lot of aspirations for social change. So I always regarded myself as a stepchild of Dr. King, because all of a sudden, here's this bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama, and these are people standing up, and they're forging social change. And I said, well, damn, you know, I can do something like this. And I went to law school to become a civil rights lawyer. I went to actually NYU, class of '65, with the purple. Yeah, there you go. Violet, I think they call it. Yeah, no. So I've always regarded as the existence of the civil rights movement. You know, I have a broader left perspective generally, but specifically, the thing that allowed me to frame my life trajectory was the black civil rights movement in the South. And I'm a big winner in that.
And we're awfully glad you did. Please thank our speaker, Kent Spriggs. If you've just arrived, remember you would have received one of these. This is one of our demographic surveys. Around the edge of this red card are questions, and then there are numbers or answers. Kindly tear or circle the answer that applies to you. You'll see that your name is not asked, so feel free to be truthful. We'll never identify the card with you. This helps us to know who our audience is when we want to apply for sponsorships or funding. So you're giving us the information we need to describe our audience to people who want to support us in the future. We're going to take a break for about 7 minutes as we change the scenery and get ready for our next speakers. Thank you.